In the last lesson, we saw how we could use the navigation controller in order to be able to move from one scene to another and go back again. And we saw that we could do that without any code. A lot of times, however, we want to pass some data from one scene to another when we navigate. Unfortunately, we do need a touch of code for that, but not tons. So let's take a look at doing that. I've got the same basic storyboard we had in the last lesson, except I've added a few things. I've added a text box on view 1 and a label control on view 2. And I simply want to pass the text that the user enters in view 1 over to view 2 when we navigate to it. To help me out a little bit on that, I've also selected the segue and given that segue an identifier, and we'll see why that's important in a little bit. The other thing I did is I created another view controller for Swift code. So I added to my project view controller 2. And I'll just show you very quickly how I can do that. I can right click and say new file. And I choose a Cocoa Touch class. And give it a class name and make sure that I have subclass of type UI view controller. When I'm creating these classes, I can create any type of controller or view type or object type that I want. In this case, I want a basic UI view controller. By default, often it's just an S object, and that'll just give you a vanilla class. So when I created that class, I got this empty viewcontroller2.swift class. The next thing I needed to do was to let my storyboard know that this view is associated with that class. So I selected my view 2 scene, went to the identity inspector, and in this class dropdown, I was able to find view controller 2, and I selected that. You can see if I look at view 1 that its class is view controller, which is that view controller that we got by default. So in that way, as you add views and scenes to your storyboard, you can also add corresponding view controllers in Swift code to go along with each one of those scenes. Once I did that, I created outlets for the text box, and that outlet ended up in my view controller. And then I also created an outlet for my label, and that shows up in my view 2 controller. So that's what we have in the storyboard. So now I want to be able to pass the data. Well, I need to create something to pass the data to in view 2. So let's go back to that view 2 controller, and I create a variable of string type called label text. Then I create a function called viewDidAppear, and as we talked about before, this will occur every time the view is shown. ViewDidLoad, of course, happens anytime the class is created, but viewDidAppear will be called every time the view becomes visible. So we can constantly update every time we segue to this view. So in this function, I set my labels text property equal to the value of that variable label text. So that's all I have in the view controller 2. So view controller 1 obviously does a bit more work, but not tons. We have one override function called prepare for segue. And prepare for segue happens before we actually make the segue from view 1 to view 2. So at this time, I can gather any data that I need on view 1 and get ready to pass it to view 2. For the parameter, I do have a UI storyboard segue object. And I'm going to check that identifier to make sure I know which view I'm going to. And this identifier will tell me that. So you remember we set on our segue that its identifier was view 2 segue. So that's why this has become important, because now we know that we are going to be going to view 2. And if we are, then we want to get our destination view controller, and we'll cast it as a view controller 2. And we'll set that into that variable called destination. Now I have the view controller 2 object that I'm going to be going to. So I can set that destination label text property to the text in my text input. So whatever the user has entered in TXT input, I'm going to pass it into that variable that we created on view controller 2 called label text. And then when we get into view controller 2, label text will have been set from that segue from the view controller 1. And then I can just set my labels text property equal to that value. So we'll give that a run. And here's my sample text. And if I go to view 2, there it is. And you could see that little bit of a flash where the label was already set to label, and then I reset it to sample text. And just to prove I didn't have any magic along with that, again, you can see that it picks up the update. So that's the basics of using a segue to pass data from one view to another.